Today we're going to look at Chapter 22, Part B, over the digestive system. We'll start with the pharynx. Food passes from the oral cavity to the oropharynx, then the laryngopharynx. Pharynx is another name for your throat. The throat allows passage of foods, fluids, and air, and its mucosa is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. We saw stratified squamous epithelium also in the oral cavity. There is skeletal muscle in the muscularis externa of the pharynx, and there's some pharyngeal constrictors. We'll move next into the esophagus. We'll look at its mucosa, which is also stratified squamous epithelium, but the esophagus is really just a flat muscular tube. It's going to go from the laryngopharynx to the stomach, or it connects the throat to the stomach. It does go through the diaphragm at the esophageal hiatus, and where it joins the stomach, that part is called the cardia, and that specific part where the connection between the esophagus and stomach is the cardial orifice. The sphincter that dilates to allow food to go from the esophagus into the stomach is called the cardiac sphincter or gastroesophageal sphincter. A homeostatic imbalance associated with this esophagus-stomach junction is heartburn. Heartburn occurs when stomach acid regurgitates into the esophagus, and if you drink too much or eat a lot of food, then it's likely that you'll suffer from heartburn. Individuals who are extremely obese, pregnant, or have just gone for a run will also possibly suffer from heartburn. It's also common in those who have a hiatal hernia, which is a structural abnormality where part of the stomach has moved above the diaphragm, and this can cause even more stomach acid to get into the esophagus and irritate it. So it's commonly going to cause esophagitis, which is inflammation of the esophagus, esophageal ulcers or perforations of both mucosa and submucosa, and esophageal cancer. The esophageal mucosa contains stratified squamous epithelium, and we'll see a shift as we move from the esophagus to the stomach. We'll see a shift from stratified squamous to simple columnar. The esophageal glands of the submucosa secrete mucus, and this will aid in bolus movement throughout the esophagus and allow it to more easily get from point A to point B in the esophagus and eventually to the stomach. Its muscularis externa contains both skeletal and smooth muscle. It contains just skeletal muscle superiorly. It contains mixed skeletal and smooth muscle in the middle, and just smooth muscle inferiorly. And almost all of the esophagus has an adventitia instead of a serosa, but the part of the esophagus that is below the diaphragm does have a serosa instead of an adventitia. But if asked on a test if the esophagus contains a serosa, you want to say no. You just want to go with an adventitia because that's over the predominant part of the esophagus. Here we can see some histology of the esophagus. We can see without any food in its lumen that the mucosa is convoluted. We can also see here that the mucosa of the esophagus is much thicker than the mucosa of the stomach, and we can see the esophagus-stomach junction. We're going from stratified epithelium to simple epithelium, and specifically from a squamous epithelium to a columnar epithelium. In the oral cavity, the processes we saw were ingestion, mechanical breakdown, propulsion, and chemical digestion. Ingestion was taking food into the oral cavity. The mechanical breakdown we saw was chewing. Propulsion was deglutition, which is swallowing the bolus from the oral cavity into the pharynx and then later into the esophagus. So deglutition is another name for swallowing. The chemical digestion that took place was breakdown of carbohydrates via salivary amylase produced by the main salivary glands. Lingual lipase is also produced by the salivary glands but is not active until it hits the stomach. Only a couple of drugs are absorbed in the mouth or oral cavity, but other than that, there is absolutely no absorption in the oral cavity. Mastication is when the cheeks and the lips are closed and we're holding food in our oral cavity, and we move our tongue around and use our teeth to grind and cut food. So this is going to be partly reflexive and partly voluntary movement. So ingestion includes voluntarily chewing food and moving it around, but part of it's reflexive because of stretch reflexors and pressure receptors that we find in the cheek, gums, and tongue. During mastication, we mix the food with saliva and we compact it. The compacted food mixed with saliva is called a bolus. Again, deglutition is swallowing, so it does involve the tongue, it involves the soft palate, it involves your throat, and the esophagus. It's actually 22 muscle groups that we need in order to coordinate deglutition. There's a buccal phase and a pharyngeal-esophageal phase. During the buccal phase, we're going to contract the tongue voluntarily in order to mix the food with saliva. We'll then push the food back towards the pharynx, and the pharyngeal-esophageal phase includes the parts of deglutition that occur in those structures, the pharynx and the esophagus. So here we can see the steps of deglutition. So we have a buccal phase where the bolus is in the oral cavity, but then moves into the pharynx. And then the pharyngeal-esophageal phase is when the food or bolus is in the pharynx and then passes the pharyngeal constrictors and moves into the esophagus. And the food will then move all the way through the esophagus, eventually reach the cardiac sphincter or gastroesophageal sphincter, and when that dilates, it'll allow the bolus to enter the stomach. So during the buccal phase, the upper esophageal sphincter is contracted, meaning that food would not immediately go from the pharynx then into the esophagus. We would need dilation of that upper esophageal sphincter. The tongue, though, would be pressing the food mixed with saliva to your upper palate, and it would specifically be pushing more against your soft palate, and it's going to be forcing the food into your oropharynx. During the pharyngeal-esophageal phase, we'll see that the food has moved into your oropharynx and down past then your laryngopharynx. We will still have the upper esophageal sphincter slightly contracted at first, and it'll only start to relax as the food pushes on that upper esophageal sphincter and then allow that food to enter the esophagus. The constrictor muscle will close again once the food has passed from the pharynx into the esophagus, and then peristalsis will be the type of contraction that occurs along the esophagus to get the food to move into the stomach. So peristalsis moves food through the esophagus to the stomach. We can see here in this image the lower part of the esophagus, and we can see the gastroesophageal sphincter. In this image, it is closed. In order for the bolus of food to move from the esophagus to the stomach, that gastroesophageal sphincter needs to open. When it does open, the food or bolus will enter via the cardial orifice, and it'll officially be in the stomach and be subject to both the acidic and enzymatic conditions therein. So let's move on and look at the stomach. Let's talk about its gross anatomy. It has many parts. We find the stomach in the upper left quadrant. It is temporary storage for food. It'll help digest that bolus into chyme. So food mixed with saliva is a bolus, but when that bolus is not only mixed with the digestive juices in the stomach, but also acid, it then becomes chyme. So the food enters the stomach as a bolus, it leaves as chyme. The first part of the stomach we're going to talk about is the cardial part. So this is the part around the cardial orifice. It's the location of the gastroesophageal or cardiac sphincter. Above this location, there's a dome-shaped region. It's below the diaphragm, but above the cardia, and this is a dome-shaped or fundus region of the stomach. The main part or mid-portion of the stomach is called the body. And the pyloric part of the stomach includes both an antrum, a pyloric canal, and a pylorus. The antrum is adjacent to the body, the pyloric canal adjacent to the antrum, and the pylorus is a narrowed region that leads to the pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter. Here we can see those images. We can also see that the stomach has 3 layers of muscle. Most of the GI tract has just 2, but the stomach has 3 layers of muscle, so it has a longitudinal, circular, and oblique layer in its muscularis externa. We can also see the cardia, which is near the gastroesophageal sphincter, and this is where the esophagus meets the stomach. The domed region above the cardia, at the top of our image here, is the fundus. We're also seeing that inside the stomach are a lot of mucosal folds. These mucosal folds are called rugae, and when the stomach fills with food or stretches, these rugae disappear. But in an empty stomach, the rugae are readily visible. On the side of the stomach that is closest to the liver, there is a lesser curvature. On the side of the stomach closest to the spleen, there is a greater curvature, and the mid portion of the stomach is called the body. What we can see best here, though, is the pyloric part of the stomach. We can see that the inferior portion of the stomach starts to narrow as it gets closer and closer to the duodenum, or the first part of the small intestine. The pyloric antrum is close to the body, narrowed further into the pyloric canal, and the pylorus is located around the pyloric sphincter. As food leaves the stomach, it moves into the small intestine. What's moving into the small intestine is chyme that has been treated by the gastric secretions, including things like pepsin and hydrochloric acid, in the stomach, and now has to be moved in small parts to the duodenum and neutralized. So just some more gross anatomy for the stomach. We have greater and lesser curvatures. The greater curvature, again, is on the convex lateral surface, which was the side near the spleen. Lesser curvature was on the concave medial surface, or the side near the liver. Other things you'll find around the stomach are mesenteries, which we learned in Part A of Chapter 22. And we learned in Part A that mesenteries were double layers of peritoneum. There is a lesser and greater omentum that are both mesenteries that are attached to the stomach. The greater omentum contains fat deposits and lymph nodes. It's also a great location for blood vessels. And the lesser omentum goes from the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach and helps hold the stomach in place. The greater omentum is kind of like a fat blanket that covers most of the abdominal wall, and it's going to cover the small intestine, spleen, and parts of the transverse colon and connects with the mesocolon, a mesentery that holds parts of the colon in place. Here we can see the stomach in a cadaver. We can see the greater curvature's location near the spleen, and we can also see that the cut liver is closer to the lesser curvature side. In this image, we can see the greater omentum, which looks like a kind of flimsy fat blanket that is over parts of the abdominal pelvic wall and viscera. In this image, the liver and the gallbladder are moved out of the way, and we can see the lesser omentum connecting the liver to the stomach. In this image, we can see the mesentery. The mesentery connects the small intestine, specifically the jejunum and ileum, to each other, and the mesocolons would connect the sigmoid and transverse colon to the abdominal wall. The stomach does have a vascular and nerve supply. The nerve supply is of the autonomic nervous system, so there are sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves that go to the GI tract and the stomach. The blood supply includes the celiac trunk, and veins of the hepatic portal system actually drain blood from the stomach and have it looked over in the liver to make sure there's no pathogens in it. The stomach has all four tunics. We saw in the muscularis externa that it had an extra oblique layer of muscle. So it is important to know that the tunics of the stomach are slightly different. We have an extra oblique layer in the muscularis externa, and in the mucosa, we have gastric pits. We don't see such structures in other parts of the GI tract, but the gastric pits contain cells that are both either hormone-producing or gastric glands. The mucosa, again, is simple columnar in the stomach, and in that simple columnar epithelium, there's areas where we have indentations or pits that lead to gastric glands. These gastric glands produce gastric juice. So here is a small image of the gastric pits that we would find dotting the surface or mucosa of the stomach. You can see there's different types of cells found in these gastric pits, and they all have different functions. The types of cells you might find are mucous neck cells, parietal cells, chief cells, and enteroendocrine cells. Enteric or entero is a common prefix used to associate or talk about the small intestine, or just a general term for the GI tract. Here we can see some of those cells in the gastric pit. They're showing you in this image that a parietal cell secretes hydrochloric acid, and that chief cell secrete pepsinogen. Hydrochloric acid gives the stomach a very acidic environment, an average of a pH of 2, whereas pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme that must be turned into pepsin. Pepsin is the active enzyme. Pepsin can digest protein, so pepsin, protein, both start with P. That's one way to remember it. But if there is not an acidic environment for pepsinogen, it'll never become pepsin. So the glands in the fundus and the body produce the most gastric juice. So we'll find a lot of gastric pits in those areas. The parietal cell secretions, again, are hydrochloric acid. That's a combination of chlorine and hydrogen. And it has a pH that ranges from 1.5 to 3.5. And that's low enough or acidic enough to denature protein or to break down protein. That is going to be one way that we can help mechanically and then chemically digest protein in the stomach, but another is to activate pepsin. Pepsin is a protein digesting enzyme. We also need the stomach to make intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor allows us to absorb vitamin B12 from food that we eat or parts of our diet. Chief cell secretions are pepsinogen, which remember we need to turn into pepsin. Lipases, which some become active, like our lingual lipase in the stomach. And now we're learning that the stomach produces its own lipases. So pepsinogen turns into pepsin in the stomach because of the acidic environment provided by hydrochloric acid. Lipases are just enzymes produced in the stomach that can digest lipids, but they only digest about 15% of lipids. Most lipid digestion occurs in the small intestine. The enteroendocrine cells are hormone-secreting cells of the gastric area or of the stomach. They act nearby or locally, mainly, and those would be the ones that act as paracrines, serotonin, and histamine, but those like somatostatin and gastrin can be produced and then secreted into the blood and act a little less locally, a little far-reaching. The mucosal barrier of the stomach is a mucosal barrier. It's actually a bicarbonate-rich mucosal barrier that prevents the acid produced by parietal cells from destroying the stomach itself. All of the epithelial cells that we find in the mucosa of the stomach have tight junctions holding them together, and this prevents the acidic gastric juice from seeping underneath that mucosa and into the submucosa and deeper tissues. But still, the mucosa is damaged over time, and the damaged epithelial cells of the stomach have to be quickly replaced by the division of stem cells that remain at the basal layer of the mucosa. So we replace the surface cells of the stomach every 3 to 6 days because of the harsh digestive conditions in the stomach. A homeostatic imbalance we want to mention is inflammation of the stomach or gastritis. Mainly, it would be inflammation of the mucosal barrier in the stomach. So gastritis is common if something interrupts the production of that bicarbonate-rich mucosal barrier. So peptic or gastric ulcers can form. They are erosions of the stomach wall if the mucosal barrier is disrupted for a long period of time. Erosions of the stomach wall can become serious and perforate into the peritoneum and lead to leakage of gastric secretions into the peritoneum and cause peritonitis or hemorrhaging. So that's when peptic or gastric ulcers become very severe and possibly life-threatening. One organism that actually increases the chances of peptic or gastric ulcers forming is H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori. It's a bacterium that interferes with production of the bicarbonate-rich mucosal barrier. Also, some NSAIDs or nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories can also interfere with creation of an adequate bicarbonate-rich mucosal barrier. Here in this image, we can see A is a gastric ulcer lesion. So this is a perforation through the mucosa. It's not all the way through to the serosa, but we can see that it is perforating through the layers or tunics of the stomach. And then B, we're seeing H. pylori bacteria laying on the mucosa of the stomach, and they're kind of eating away or disrupting that mucosal layer, and that would cause the acid in the stomach to have a harsher reaction with the epithelium if it's not protected by that bicarbonate-rich mucosal barrier. And then next time we're going to talk about the digestive processes that occur in the stomach, beginning with mechanical breakdown and going all the way through that until the stomach would empty its contents called chyme into the small intestine.